Let's talk about all things political with Mark Littlewood now. He's the Director of Popular Conservatism and joins us. Very good morning to you, Mark.
Good morning, Julia. Good to be with you.
I just want to check before we go any further. Do you want us to reclaim the England flag on St George's Day from those awful people who sow division, according to the Prime Minister?
Completely ludicrous, isn't it? I mean, I don't think the Prime Minister understands what a flag represents. Flags are, by definition, exclusive. They're not inclusive. They show a difference, right? It's why Brits wave the Union Jack and the French wave the tricolour. If you believe in a society which is only about inclusion, then, well, you might as well just wave, a picture of the globe.
We know what flag that Keir Starmer prefers to wave. I believe it's blue with yellow stars on.
Yeah, it could well be that, or some rainbow concoction of some sort.
Well, yes, indeed. How damaging do you think the trans madness has been for Labour? I mean, I think it's been pretty damaging for the Tories because they were in power for 14 years, and although the current leader, Kemi Badenoch, has been totally sound on this, came out fighting yesterday, hopefully she's going to come out fighting at PMQs today as well. But, basically, Tories sat and watched all this happening under their watch and did not act, and I'm still furious with them for that. But Labour has been so divided on this issue. Keir Starmer having to waiting 6 days to give his verdict on the Supreme Court ruling, and then Downing Street later on pointing out that he no longer believes that trans women, i.e. men, are women. It's all been very embarrassing. But how damaging in terms of dealing with voters has it been? Is it just a side issue, or is it quite a major issue?
No, I think it is a major issue because I think it just shows how utterly detached vast swathes of the political elite are from normal public opinion. Yeah. I mean, people just look on aghast. And what I want to hear from the Prime Minister, or indeed anybody else who has apparently changed their mind, is why. I mean, you've got to abide by the Supreme Court ruling, but you don't necessarily have to agree with it. Yeah. What other matters of science does Keir Starmer require the Supreme Court to clear up for him? Does he need the Supreme Court to tell us that the Galileo was right and the world is actually a globe, that Newton's law of gravity pertains? Are there any other scientific matters that the Prime Minister needs these judges to provide a ruling on? So why has he changed his mind? Yeah. He did say that he thought 99.9% of women don't have a penis. Well, that leaves, I think, in Britain, according to his numbers, 35,000 women who apparently do. I'd like to know who he thinks those people are.
Again, I've done a weekly check for years and still not found mine.
It's absolutely extraordinary. But I think the desperate thing here, and you're right, I'm not trying to be too partisan about it. I think politicians of all stripes in the main political parties come out of this badly. It is ludicrous that this has had to go to a Supreme Court judgment. Yeah. That is because our politicians have been unable to grasp the basics of biology, that it has actually had to go all the way to the Supreme Court. Really, how we deal with trans and single-sex spaces and all of the rest of it is a political issue that politicians should decide on. But because they have been so utterly confused in their public pronouncements, we've had to hand yet more power to the judiciary. Over the long run, I think that's a bad thing.
Well, exactly. It is quite... It's a very good point, though, but why? Because nothing has changed. The law is what the law is. Although apparently as a top KC and a former Director of Public Prosecutions, Keir Starmer couldn't actually interpret the law properly. Do you think on that issue that is going to continue to run? There's no doubt it's been a strong one for Kemi Badenoch. But again, you've got the likes, Nigel Farage at Reform and others who've just been like, well, yeah, of course this is all insane, and they've been calling it out for years. Not in power, not having to deal with collective cabinet responsibility and the like. But do you think that's still going to be an issue at the next election? Because again, I want to talk about the economy as well, of course, because the economy is the number one issue for most people. They vote based on, do I feel better or worse off than I are? And there's also the cultural side of being proud to be British and having confidence in the future. But does whether men who think they're women or men who are wearing dresses going into women's toilets, is that going to be a deal breaker for a lot of voters?
It might not be that single specific issue, Julia. It might not be that millions and millions of people, cast their votes based on whether trans women can compete in a particular sport. But it goes to this wider picture of the British people feeling that the mainstream political parties are totally out of touch and live in an alternative reality. Yeah. And the more that the established parties continue to bang on about this completely alternative reality that most, the overwhelming bulk of normal people in Britain just do not recognise, the more likely it is that I think people will plump for, say, Reform UK or, vote for something new and different that seems to be more simpatico with basic, normal, standard, median, mainstream British opinion. So it's one of a number of issues which I think just shows how out of touch the government is.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I'm always amazed, and the media as well, because the amount of years when I've been doing, BBC or Sky News or other broadcasting, and you say something that's so blatantly obvious and common sense and a majority opinion and fact-based, and the presenter and the producers look at you, I mean, as if you've just... I don't know. I mean, literally said, I think slavery is a good thing. I mean, they genuinely are just living in such a mad little world. And again, why they were surprised as they were by the Brexit vote, which didn't necessarily surprise the rest of us. But you mentioned about the threat of reform. Just before we go to the economy then, I do want to talk about Robert Jenrick. He's the Shadow Justice Secretary. He came second in the Tory leadership contest last year. We know he's still the favourite to take over from Kemi Badenoch. And when there are mutterings about her performance and whether she's, garnering support, she's, Tories are flatlining in the polls, Reform are way above them and consistently so. Robert Jenrick has been obviously completely accidentally recorded while talking to University College London Conservative Association students. And he said in this report, which is Sky News have got exclusively, that he vowed to bring this coalition together to ensure that Conservatives and Reform UK are no longer fighting each other for votes by the time of the next election. He's saying he's working hard to put Reform UK out of business, which idea is, it will be us, not Reform, in the next election. But he says, my worry is that they become a kind of permanent or semi-permanent fixture on the British political scene. And if that is the case, and as I say, I'm trying to do everything I can to stop that being the case, he says, then life becomes a lot harder for us because the right is not united. And then you head towards the general election where the nightmare scenario is that Keir Starmer sails in through the middle as a result of the two parties being disunited. He says, I'm not prepared for that to happen. I want the fight to be united. And so, the crucial words, one way or another, I am determined to do that and to bring this coalition together and make sure we unite as a nation as well. This is code for if we can't beat Reform, we better join them, isn't it?
Well, he's right in what he says, isn't it? I mean, it would be crazy, I think, to look at the present opinion polls and to assume that if you're a Conservative, there's no problem at all. The Conservatives are on a trajectory to victory. And it's the Conservatives' failings, really, that have brought Reform into being. The Conservatives deserted a huge tranche of political real estate, which Nigel Farage was then very happy to go and camp on. Yeah. So the Conservatives, by no longer being Conservative, have allowed Reform to arise. And I rather agree with Robert Jenrick's comments. I mean, look, God only knows what the opinion polls will look like in 3 or 4 years' time when we approach an election. But if they're anything like they are at the moment, do those on the right of centre seriously want to go into an election with, say, Reform on 24%, Labour on 23% and the Conservatives on 22%? You could re-elect a Labour government that gets less than a quarter of the vote. It would be absurd, especially, and I think this is really the key point, if over the coming year or two, Reform and the Conservatives are light upon a very similar policy agenda. To, leave ECHR, abandon carbon net zero, get tax and spending down. I mean, they needn't be identical. But if the key principles and planks of both the Conservative and the Reform agenda overlap, it might not be a circle, but it could be a Venn diagram with a lot of overlap, then it would seem pretty crazy not to try and find a way, some sort of way of working together in order to take the first opportunity to remove this dire government from office.
Well, would that mean, not a formal coalition? I mean, that's something that Nigel Farage has ruled out again and again, and Richard Tice, his deputy. But also, we've got the same issue where, in the 2019 election, people forget one of the among the reasons why Boris Johnson won that 80 majority was get Brexit done. People wanted an end to it or get it done. Jeremy Corbyn was the man he was standing up against, not Keir Starmer, but also because Reform stood down, 250 or more candidates. You wouldn't have had that free run otherwise. So are you talking about a formal coalition or just an unofficial wink, wink, we won't stand where you're strongest, you don't stand where we're strongest?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to say what the final, any collaboration could eventually look like, and it would probably depend on the strength of the parties in the polls at the time. Maybe the Conservatives start to tick upwards, maybe Reform's hit their ceiling, who knows? But I think it could be anything from a full-blown merger to I don't know, standing down in a range of seats for each other, in which you haven't got a snowball in hell's chance in a given seat, but the other party does. It doesn't seem to me very likely that Reform are going to win many seats in the affluent South, but the Conservatives could take a lot back from the Liberal Democrats. Similarly, there are seats where the Conservatives don't really have a presence. About 90 seats, I think, where Reform are second to Labour. Those would presumably be the ones where if the Conservatives were to withdraw, you could see Reform winning them. So exactly how it takes place, or even whether the two parties merge in some way, who knows? It would be a bit like going back to the days of the Liberal SDP alliance back in the 1980s, that the exact, I think, formulation of it is, a long way from being sorted out. And the need for it is only there if the parties remain roughly neck and neck. You're right, Reform are a little bit ahead of the Conservatives, but more or less within the margin of error in the polls. Then I think at some point, some form of collaboration needs to be found. And it'd be pretty useful, I think, if more people were speaking a bit like Robert Jenrick, sort of opening one's arms to the other side, rather than just throwing insults at each other, because that makes it extremely hard to work together down the line if everybody's fallen out with each other before you even get to form a negotiation.
Indeed. Let's finally talk about the small matter of the economy. And Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, is over in the United States for a big meeting of the International Monetary Fund, meeting with other Treasury ministers, just as the IMF slashes global economic forecast, US economic forecast, but also UK growth forecast slashed from 1.1%, whoopity-doo-dah, down by to just 1.1%, down by 0.5 percentage points since the start of the year. And interestingly, the chief economist at the IMF said, look, the Chancellor can't blame Trump tariffs and what's going on in the global trade war. And he says, actually, it's domestic factors that are the biggest problems, surging utility bills and higher government borrowing costs. That's what he says the problems are. Very telling ahead of the autumn budget we're going to get this year.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, unfortunately, we've backed ourselves into a real corner. We know what brings growth about. All politicians say how much they want it, but they seem to will the ends without willing any of the means. If you actually want growth, you've got to have a much smaller state, less government spending, a much more of a role for the private sector, lower taxes, far less regulation than we have at the moment, and you can start to breathe. Now, obviously, you can catch a good wind or an ill wind from elsewhere, depending on what Trump gets up to or what wars might be going on in the rest of the world or God knows what. But nevertheless, you're under an obligation, I think, to make sure your own economy is as match fit and resilient as it can be. And we are miles from that. And we have to have a serious discussion about what government spending we are going to cut altogether. We are still, I think, believing this fiction that we can keep spending taxpayers' money at the rate we are at the moment and expect to ever pay back our debts or see any meaningful growth.
Yeah, exactly.
1% is pathetic.
I mean, no, it's an embarrassment. It really is. Mark Littlewood, great to talk to you, Director of Public Conservatism.
Well, thanks for watching. And if you enjoyed that video, please make sure you give it a like and subscribe to the Popcorn YouTube channel. You can also find out more about us on our website, popularconservatism.com, and you can follow us on social media. Details are in the show notes below.